Hello, fans, and welcome to JJ, the JJ Dillon podcast. We have a lot of great things to talk to you about. And of course, the star of the show is the greatest manager of all time. He's worked behind the scenes in the WWF, WCW, Championship Wrestling from Florida, and everywhere in between. He is, of course, JJ Dillon. JJ, what is going on in your world?
Well, first of all, I'm flattered by the introduction, but um, when you talk about the greatest manager in the world, I acquiesce to Bobby the Brain Heenan. I look at Bobby as the person who set the bar, and then that's what I strive to try to get to the same level that Bobby did, and I also going back, Bobby Davis when he was with Buddy Rogers and Bob Orton. That's when I first got interested in wrestling, and of course, sadly, a lot of times our history is not preserved, and Bobby Davis from that era really was one of the great managers as well.
Now, I am JP, John Paz. I will be joining you every week as JJ's co-host, kind of bringing you down the road and bringing you through all of JJ's travels. Of course, JJ, welcoming back into the podcast world. And I feel like you're one of those guys who've been everywhere. You've seen everything. You've done everything. You worked in all the major promotions. You worked for all the big names, Vince, Eric Bischoff, Dusty Rhodes, so on and so forth. So you need to get those stories out there. And I feel like me being an historian, feel like JJ Dillon is the perfect person to have a show and the perfect guy to get those stories out for not only the last 10 years, but 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, even
oh my God, now you're giving
my
age away.
Dating back 60 years.
Yeah, I've been very, very, very fortunate. I fell in love. Actually, what happened was I was born and raised in Trenton, New Jersey, and like most young guys that age, baseball was big for me. And it was the era where the Dodgers were still in Brooklyn, the Giants were still in New York, and of course the Yankees. And in 1958, the Dodgers moved to L.A. and the Giants moved to San Francisco. Of course, the Yankees still remained here, and it was at a time prior to the internet and. I remember following my beloved Dodgers, and I would get up and get the morning paper, and they would go to press about their deadline was like third inning in the West Coast game, and so I would just have a very partial line score through about 3 innings, and it was hard to keep the interest level the same. So that's when right about the time where. I'd always enjoyed wrestling, but I really gravitated, the majority of my interest to wrestling as a result of that situation. And then, of course, things fell in place for me, from that time forward. And, I look back now and I can't believe how long it's been. And, I've got 2 Hall of Fame rings. And back then, Hall of Fame was baseball Cooperstown. There was no Hall of Fame in wrestling. Yep. So for me to be part of the WWE Hall of Fame, which in Miami, the Horsemen were inducted, and then the following year there is actually a Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame that started in Albany, New York, and they have a process where they select people for consideration, and they have a body of voters that includes former wrestlers, historians, and what have you. And so the year after I was inducted in the WWE Hall of Fame, I was also inducted into the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. So I'm the proud recipient of 2 Hall of Fame plaques and 2 gold rings. And then, that to me, validates everything that I did over all those years. And it's the old saying that, if you love what you're doing, you never work a day in your life. So in terms of working for like you say, I worked for Vince McMahon. I was a vice president of talent relations for almost 8 years, and then went to Ted Turner and held a similar position there. So, and prior to that, in the old territory days, before it got down to just the two major players, I wrestled and actually physically wrestled. I had over 3,200 matches over a 20-year period, and wrestled in most of the major territories, and made I think last count was like 15 trips to Japan, anywhere from a week on a tour to as much as 6 weeks, all of which I did with Giant Baba and All Japan Wrestling. And then went to Australia and wrestled there for a year while living there, and did a side tour on the way in for a month in New Zealand and on the way back. And then I've also had an opportunity to go to Europe, which is a different approach, a different style of wrestling, where I went to work for Otto Wanz in Bremen, Germany, and over there they have a round system. So that took some adjustment to here we think of psychology and where you're not constrained by a time limit, and if you have rounds, you got a 3-minute or 5-minute, whatever it is, and then you got a 30-second or a minute a break, and so it's like not that it's impossible. It's just a matter of adjusting your thought process. So I've had a chance to pretty much do it all, thank goodness.
And it's going to be awesome for me. I've been a wrestling fan for over 30 years. So it's going to be awesome for me to kind of take this journey with you. And for instance, you mentioned Japan and Giant Baba. When we get to that, which are several weeks away, but when we get to that, that's going to be not just one little story. I'm sure we're going to be able to break that off into a million stories, because you have so many stories. And getting to talk to you a little bit off air, you have so many stories. It's crazy. I mean, I can mention one little name to you, and boom, you have a whole story about him.
Yeah, I'm fortunate because I did, travel globally. Not only in the South Pacific with Japan. I never went to Singapore up that way, but I spent a lot of time in Australia, and also some tours in New Zealand when Steve Ricard was promoting there. And then I think I was actually keeping track at some point, just that more out of curiosity, and I think I actually physically wrestled in 44 of the 52 states. Not all of Canada, but a good part of Canada, and down in the Caribbean. And of course, I always wanted to go to Europe. I never really wrestled in England, but I did have a chance to go for one of the tournaments in Germany with Otto Wanz, which was a unique experience. Just because of the round system, which we're so used to here, setting up a pace, and everybody's got their own pace, their own way of doing it, and you have to recalibrate your whole thinking when you're talking about a round system, because if it's a 3 or 5 minute round and then the bell stops and there's a 30-second or a minute rest period, and then you start back, so the approach has to be entirely different.
Yeah, and I feel like with you, I mean, that obviously will be a complete episode or maybe even a couple episodes. But with you, I mean, there's so many interesting topics. And just to kind of start it off and just kind of go in different directions, we're going to try to focus on one topic if we can. I know we're kind of going to branch off and get other topics, but try to focus on one topic on each episode. And even eventually down the road, we're going to have some guests join us. And I know we talked about this yesterday. Arn Anderson, I talked to him today. He's very interested. He will be joining the show in a couple of weeks. He's very interested in coming on. Obviously, he's very busy. He's got his own show now, and he's got AEW going on. I talked to Tully Blanchard. He was very excited you're coming back to do a podcast. So we got a lot of guys interested in coming on, a lot of friends of yours, JJ.
Yeah. Well, Tully and Arn are, when you talk about people that are icons in the business, I mean, they're, and I always thought that the Ole and Gene Anderson were as great a tag team as maybe I ever saw. And then being around Tully and Arn as a tag team for as long as I was, boy, boy, if I had to say, well, which is the greatest tag team of all, I'd have a hard time picking. And then during that era, being around the Midnight Express with Dennis Condrey and Bobby Eaton with Jim Cornette. So you talked earlier about greatest managers, and everybody would have an opinion. Well, who's the greatest? You could ask 10 people, and 10 people might give you a different answer as to who they thought the greatest manager of all was. Going back to Bobby Davis back when I first started watching, when he was managing Buddy Rogers and Bobby Orton, on through Jim Cornette and a guy that Gary Hart, who never gets the mainstream press like he should deserve, like he really deserves, because he never had a run on the big stage. And by that I mean I'm talking about the New York territories that got more global exposure. But in terms of great managers, I'd go so far as to say I don't think there were any better than Playboy Gary Hart. Yeah,
he basically, obviously world class in so many different territories, but as far as major runs, he just had a small run in WCW, and he managed Muta for a little bit and Buzz Sawyer, but they never really gave him a long extended period where he was in the main event or had a main event player the whole time. This is Muta coming up, this is Buzz Sawyer kind of in the mid card, and they basically were using them as leverage for the Horseman turning heel, basically. So they weren't really using Gary Hart to his full potential while he was in WCW. He did manage Terry Funk for a little bit in the main event, but it was only for a short period of time.
Well, Gary Hart, too, was from the Dallas area, and he, I think Fritz von Erich had a lot to do with always trying to create a scenario where Gary was essential and that he couldn't leave, that he needed him, because he was a big part of the success over a period of time in Texas. And so he could stay there, and which is basically what he did, and never really got, because you had San Antonio, you had Dallas, and a lot of times it was a unique situation when you went there that you wanted to be figured in with Fritz for Dallas and Fort Worth for the two major towns. And then Joe Blanchard was promoting San Antonio and Corpus Christi. So you were hoping that, because in San Antonio they produced their own TV too, so you wanted to be part of that and be figured in. And then really the third piece of that was Paul Bosch in Houston, and if you ask anybody from that era about if they had a magic wand and could choose who they wanted to work for, most of them would want to work for Paul Bosch or for Sam Muchnick in St. Louis. They were the two quote unquote premier promoters. So I was fortunate that when I went in there, with Archie Goldie, the Mongolian Stomper, who I hadn't really, in my first 5 years, I was a full-time active wrestler and hadn't, living my dream and hadn't thought about really the managerial side of it. And it was only, and I had, I'd had a great run I spent 2 years in Charlotte, and then, which was mid-card, and I had some main events in small towns. And then from there, the people up in the Canadian Maritimes had a chance to see me, and they brought me up there which was a seasonal thing through the summer, and that's really where I got my break. And what they would do was bring back the quote-unquote stars from prior years, of which Archie was one. So I had like a 3-week program with Stomper. And then I went from there to Amarillo for a year, and then from there to Florida, which was always, high on my bucket list to go to Florida and work for Eddie Graham, that had the reputation in the industry as being a genius when it came to crowd psychology and what have you, and just, of finishes to matches, and so I was really looking forward to that, and had the good fortune to have a great run, and I was told when I started, Jim Crockett Sr. was still alive, and I spent like over 2 years there, and it was a big enough territory that guys like Johnny Weaver and what have you could stay there and do well financially and never have to leave there. And I remember Weaver was friends with the Cormier family, with Leo Burke, and so they wanted to bring him up to the Maritimes, and gave him star treatment, brought him up there, and he was featured in main events. And John was scheduled to go back up there for like a week, and one of the premier guys in Charlotte got hurt and was going to be out. I mean, injured to the point where he couldn't work and was going to be off for a week. And it happened to coincide with the week that Weaver was booked to go to the Maritimes. Well, John, understood that, yes, I committed to going up there, but the situation here changed, and he had a loyalty to Jim Crockett Sr. that he couldn't very well leave, go up to the Maritimes where he was going to do well for the week, and knowing that he was the ideal person because he wasn't booked that week and already in the Carolinas, and he was the logical guy to go in there, and as a replacement, the fans would be thrilled that he hadn't been advertised and would be there. So that created an opportunity for me, because when he had to stay there, Weaver did, and he didn't want to leave the people hanging up in Leo Burke and the people up in the Maritimes. And I had traveled a lot with John and worked with John, and he became he and Art Nelson and some of the guys in Charlotte really took me under their wings and really groomed me and really helped my career. And Jim Crockett one time, when I was going to go up in place of Weaver for the week, I didn't have. I remember the ticket was like $660 to go up to Halifax, and I didn't have an extra $660 saved in the bank. And Weaver told me, Mr. Crockett said he would like to have a conversation with you, so you go in the office to talk to him. So I went in, and Jim was his office was above his home on Moorhead Street. It was the third floor level, and you could park in the back, and it was separate from his residence, and you would have to go up this long 3-story stairway to get up to the top level, where you would have an entrance to go in where his office was. And I remember he had this huge mahogany desk, and he reminded me of maybe a lot of people, but Burl Ives. He was just somebody who was treated with such reverence there in the Carolinas. They used to talk about George Harris bringing in a dozen donuts every day for Mr. Crockett. I mean, he was Mr. Crockett, and that's how much. And that was throughout, not just wrestling there, but the Crockett family was one of the old original founding families in Charlotte. So Jim Crockett, aside from his success in the wrestling business, was, he was the head guy of the Crockett family, and it was a big deal in Charlotte. So I remember when I was going up, I had to replace Weaver and didn't have the money, and he told me to go in and see Jim. And I remember going into his office, and he said, "Well, I understand that we need to keep John here, and he doesn't want to leave those people hanging up there because they've been good to him too. So we asked him to handpick somebody that he thought could go up there and would do a good job, so that at the end of the week they would feel that they didn't get shortchanged." And he said, John selected you." And I said, "Oh, wow." I was just wow, I thought, and then I said, but, I don't have money for a ticket to go up there. And he said, I understand how much is the ticket, $600. And he pulled out a wad of money out of his pocket. And on the table, he counted 100, then 100, then 100, all across the table until he had $600 there. It was 660, something like that. It was an odd number. And he said, you take this and you go and buy your ticket. And when you get up there, they will reimburse you for the cost of the ticket. And then when you get back, you come in and see me and you can repay me.
Wow.
Said, oh, okay. So that's what I did. And I went up there and made a favorable impression on them that they then, with that first week, said, well, we're a seasonal territory for the summer. So, God, we know that you're there in Charlotte and you're not going anywhere, but we're talking about almost in a year from now, we would love to have you come up here and be a featured performer for our summer season. And I thought, well, I made a good enough impression on them that because each year they had to search for somebody to come up there, and they had Carl Krupp was there, and they just had guys that were already stars in the business or became stars as a result of that exposure up there. For them to put me in that category and want me to come back the following year was, really a humbling experience for me, and knowing that I could go back there, and just things all fell in place for me.
Absolutely. And that is going to be a definite, maybe a couple-parter episode as far as time in the Maritimes, the time up in Canada, some Leo Burke stories, who I know is a good friend of yours, and we'll definitely get into that. Now, as far as kind of this first episode, this preview, so to speak, but really the first episode we're recording here, I wanted to just talk about a topic that is not really just out of random, but it is just going to kind of be scattered. It's not going to be something that it's in order or it goes by a certain timeline or something like that. I just feel like we can kind of skip around and do some major points in your career. And I think something that is not as talked about as much, but I think it's just a great topic to talk to you about in your career, is the WWF in 1996. And I'm talking about when you're on your way out of the WWF and you're exiting the WWF. So this kind of episode, I just want to talk about, we can go for however long, you wanted to talk about it, and we can kind of go wherever you want to go with it. But it's basically JJ leaves the WWF in 1996. Basically, at this point, you had worked there for 7 years, almost 8 years. What do you remember about the exit?
I mean, the nature of the business is that unless you're somebody like Johnny Weaver, that basically spent his whole career in Charlotte, or Bulldog Bob Brown, that was able in the Kansas City territory with work in St. Louis to be, and he became kind of the adopted guy, or Ricky Romero in Amarillo, who had been a success in other territories, but then went to Amarillo and basically just stayed there and continued to have star status. So I knew I had a track record of moving around. A lot of guys would go and stay 3-4 months, and if you had a family and were on the road, and this is back when they had like maybe 25 regional territories around the country, and if you had a family and you would come in, there's an initial period where, because you didn't have a national cable television yet at that point, and each of those little territories was a fiefdom unto itself that produced their own TV. So you would go in there and you would basically be someone that the people in that territory didn't know, weren't familiar with. So you had a clean slate in terms of, okay, what do I do to get over? And I was never the biggest or the best. I didn't have the bodybuilder body, but in the ring, I looked bigger than I was because of my height. And my main thing was that I could talk. And that that was my saving grace. And as a result of that, I didn't. If you're, let's say, if you're an Abdullah the Butcher, you can come in the first week, and they could send you out there, and you could clean house and stab people, and in a week or two, you're already over big time. And then, but also, your longevity is also somewhat constrained by the fact that your style doesn't lead itself to be able to stay there forever. So for me, I would come in, and it would take me a little bit longer to get over because, like you say, I didn't wear gaudy robes. My style was, everybody's style was different, and my style worked for me. And I would grow on the people, and I had great success doing that way. In other words, being myself. Don't go out there and try and be something that you're not. And the upside was that doing it that way took you a little bit longer to get over, but then once you got over, you were able to stay over and stay there for a longer period of time. And that was kind of IMO for me. I didn't have to move around. Some guys, like I say, 3-4 months had to move on, and I would come in. Took me a little while to get over, and especially if in those days, you're an independent contractor, so you move into a territory, and usually there was a hub base, and like the Amarillo territory was Amarillo itself, and so you'd go to Amarillo, and I'd find an apartment, and you got to sign a lease, and know that and because of the getting over part of the process, initially you're not going to make the big money until you get over. And then once you get over, you want to be able to stay there as long as you can to maximize, what you did to get over. And then the tricky part of it is, okay, I don't want to stay here. It's not like I don't want to ride the horse until the horse's legs give out and he falls and I fall with him. You wanted to know when was the time to have an exit strategy so that you could leave and still be a main event status, knowing that you could come back and do it all over again. And that was basically my game plan that really worked well for me.
And you think about, as far as you as an executive, in '89, you basically, you end up with WWF, you leave Crockett, you end up going to Vince. And it's one of those things where your longevity in Crockett seemed like it was a while, but you actually, spend more time with Vince in the executive role. Were you used to being in the executive role and doing the behind the scenes job like that? Because WWF, like you said, they brought you in, and you mentioned before, 7 or 8 years as the vice president of talent relations. Is that something you were used to from Dusty, from Eddie Graham, and from your time in Crockett?
Well, what happened to me was when I went to Charlotte and actually got my break in the business wrestling. Now it's the first time I'm living my dream where I'm a full-time professional wrestler, wrestling 6-7 days a week. I was 3 or 4 months from my 28th birthday. I wasn't a kid. And so just Father Time was always, just one step behind me, that I thought, well, if I'm going to have, I want to have longevity in this business because I love the business. So that's what motivated me right from day one, even in Charlotte, to focus. A lot of guys just looked at their individual career, and a lot of times just their own individual match, without regard to what other matches were on the card, or everything was focused on them, on their event on any given night. And I realized that if I was going to have longevity in the business, I had to look beyond just my performance. Because again, like I said, I was almost 28 years old when I started. So Father Time was going to catch up with me. And if I was going to stay in the business, I had to broaden my, my area of expertise. And so I'm right from day one, when I would do TV, yes, TV was what got you over, so that that you could continue to do well in any given territory. But I wasn't just doing TV to get over. I was watching how the TV was structured, how the program was put together, how the matches in that 1 hour were set out to get, to hold the audience for an hour. I became really a student of the profession right from the time that I came to Charlotte. And when I moved to the next territory, then each territory had their own way of doing things, like just trying to draw a contrast. If you went to Florida, Eddie Graham had the reputation of, being surrounded by the Jack Briscoes and the guys that had amateur credentials, Hiro Matsuda, guys that, yes, there is the showbiz aspect of it, and you have to, that's a part of it. But Eddie really focused a lot of attention on the credibility of, don't let it become just show business. The other end of the spectrum was like Nick Goulas in Tennessee, or even probably a better example would be the Sheik Eddie Farhat in Michigan and Ohio. I mean, Sheik was balls to the wall, wild, throwing fire and doing, it was still, it said wrestling on the marquee out front, but wrestling had a broad reference in terms of, what is wrestling? Well, wrestling in Florida, if you went to the Sheik in Detroit and it said wrestling, and if you had two television sets and you're looking at them and you say, well, this is both wrestling. Yep. But wrestling in Florida, the fans are educated one way. The fans in Michigan are educated a totally different way. And of course, that all changed with the advent of cable television, because then the local shows that were produced in Florida that were so different from what the television show was in Detroit. Now you start with a show that's going national that really ended the that was the beginning of the end of your territory days, because now they're seeing the fans, and also with supply and demand, that if I'm in Amarillo every week, or if I'm in Detroit every week, the cable television was produced somewhere else, and wrestling fans watch wrestling, and I mean, we would see it even with business would be good in Detroit, or business would be good in Florida, or whatever. But the fans would often come to the promoter and say, when are we going to see somebody new? They were happy with what they were seeing, excited with what they're seeing, but they're also looking for, where's that next star? When are we going to see somebody new? Excuse me. And so, that was a big part of the business too, that and like I say, some guys had a shelf life that they come in 3-4 months, they'd be worn out, and they had to get an apartment, and if they had kids in school, and then they had to up and move on. And I never wanted to get into that position. And so my style was a foundation of wrestling. And because I put so much emphasis on my interviews, that enabled me to be different than other people and to give me longevity. And then, the part in the ring, I took pride in, with what talent God gave me for my size, to go out there and be able to perform and go to a territory and be able to stay there for a year. And then knowing when was the time to move out. So, and Amarillo is a great example. I went in there and I stayed for a year. My first time in there, Dick Murdoch was, Dickie, God bless him, was the local guy. And he was a couple inches taller than me. If I'm 230, he's 260, 265. I'm the heel and he's the baby face. So what's wrong with that picture? But he made me, and I would do things to him, and I would hear the stories, which Dickie, it's never like he didn't flaunt it, but I didn't go to the bars because I wasn't a tough guy. What image you saw on television was one thing, but I never got full of my own publicity where I would go to a bar and get challenged to get my butt kicked. Because the minute that happened, might as well pack my bags and leave. The aura of whatever J.J. Dillon was is now lost in that situation. So I didn't go to those places. I stayed away. And Murdoch, I used to hear the stories of, Murdoch, that was his thing. He would go hang out at the honky tonks, and he drove a pickup truck and chewed tobacco and hung it out in the honky tonks. And the local people would say, because Murdoch, again, was bigger than me in size and in weight, and they would say to God, he said, I look at Dillion and I think, man, I think maybe I might have a shot at beating him, but he kicks your ass. and Dickie didn't smile when they said that. They said, oh, so now what are you telling me? That I'm not such a tough guy because he gets the best of me? Well, guess what? Boom! He would knock him out in the bars. And so he perpetuated my reputation with me having to get out there and get involved in that.
I love that. And I also love that you're kind of ahead of the curve as far as you're already thinking with your mind. It just shows you how smart you were, and still obviously still are, but you're always thinking with your mind. You're thinking, I don't know how long physically I could do it, but if I get into an executive role, if I get into behind the scenes, if I'm paying attention to not just my match, but all the matches, I'm going to learn more. I'm going to develop myself more, and I'm going to be able to work here for longer than most of these guys. Like you said, like maybe a Dickie Murdoch beating himself up at the bar. He's beating up other people, but he's beating up his body. He's drinking a lot. He's not going to end up being an executive and somebody that's going to be there for the long term. Was that always a goal of yours? Long term in the business, stay as long as you can, make as much money as you can, and become an executive?
Absolutely, because I have a college degree. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I have a degree, and my interviews, I learned a lot from watching Bockwinkel that interviews, anybody in an interview can yell and scream and insult people. And I got so much more mileage out of, I never wanted to run the people down who were buying the tickets to see me, because if I was in their shoes, it would leave a bad taste in my mouth. So what I would do, instead of making light of the people sitting in the front row of ringside every week in Amarillo by how they dressed, or if they had a chaw of tobacco or whatever the thing was, I would transfer that to how I would talk about Dick Murdoch. I'd say, Dick Murdoch, can you imagine riding down in that pickup truck with the window down and pooey out the window and all that tobacco juice dried up along the side? Oh. In New Jersey, if he came through town like that, they would give him a ticket. They would impound the vehicle and run him out of town. In other words, I would put that down, but it would be directed right at Dick Murdoch. And the fans would say, and maybe they didn't even consciously connect the dots that way, but it's like, I'm putting Dickie down, but Dickie's one of them. So I don't think they ever sat and looked at it that way, but I was putting them down by putting Dickie down, who I openly would say he was one of you. and I'm better than he is. Which was my way of saying I'm better than you are.
Right.
I'm more educated, more sophisticated. I don't chew tobacco, and I don't, and so it's human nature. If somebody, comes across as an elitist that's trying to tell you that they're better than you are, easy not to warm up to somebody like that and to develop a tremendous dislike. And that was basically my formula. It was just that simple.
I love it, and you're kind of a mastermind, so to speak, and sometimes even way too smart for the crowds to get. But I love how you're always using the mind, you're always thinking ahead. Now, how did you kind of get into the executive role? Like, let's say when you first started out, maybe with as an Eddie Graham, like, how does he kind of just develop that trust? He sees how into all the matches you are. He sees, you wanting to learn more, or how does J.J. Dillon kind of get not only his trust but his respect, where he's thinking, okay, I'm Eddie Graham, I trust J.J. Dillon, I'm going to make him a part of my backstage team.
Well, the promoters, basically, I never looked at just my match, or I looked at the roster and looking at how the matches were structured, who went out first and why were they on first. And in a perfect scenario, the first match is you don't want them out on the floor fighting and going out, you want the first match, you want two guys who can go out there and wrestle and establish kind of a theme for the night and never have to leave the ring. Certainly never middle the referee, because you middle the referee for the very first match. Where are you going to go from there? By the time you get to the main event, then it's somebody else has to, well, I have to top what they did. I have to top what they did. By the time the main event gets out there, they've seen it all. So in terms of a successful promotion, you have to stay on top of it, you don't want the guys to think that I've got to go out there and do it all in the first match. And there's ways that you can tell them, compliment them on how great to go out there. And God, you have such skills that you didn't have to go out on the floor and do something. You got your heat in the ring, or you made that baby face. And when he came back, boy, they were going crazy. So it's like every match has its role. And in a perfect scenario, you're building momentum with each match, so that when you get up to the intermission and they come back, usually you wanted an interesting match going into the mission, and then you come back usually a lot of with a tag match or something. It was going to be a lot of action, but through that whole process, you're saving things for the main event to do that they have not seen earlier that night. So they go out there and makes the main event special. And you only learn that by watching, observing, and listening, instead of having my match quick, get a shower, get dressed, and go out because you want to see, if there's any cute girls there that night or what. If you're into your business, you watch the match and you see and especially it's important for the later matches. And I've seen situations where they go out there and the first three matches all work a headlock. And by the time the main event goes out there, the last thing you want them to do is work a headlock. Mm-hmm. They've seen that already. But you don't process that unless you observe what's going on. And that's just a small example of how, because I was 28 years old, close to 28 years old when I broke into the business, Father Time wasn't on my side. If I was going to have longevity, I had to look at the big picture, how that card was put together, looking at the television, how the television show was produced, the good and the bad, and everyone was different. And it's like you would get an education from each place. And of course, working for Eddie Graham, to me, was like going to grad school, because he had such a handle on crowd psychology and on the business. And, that was my goal, was eventually go to Florida to work for Eddie Graham. Because to me, he was like my PhD professor, and I wanted to be around him and just absorb knowledge. And I would watch him, like in Tampa, they had two dressing rooms. You come up the stairs in Tampa, and there was a railing up there. And the first door, the heels went in, and the baby faces went down the hallway and into another door down over there. But there was catacombs in the middle, inside, where both could get access together. And especially with a main event match, that you wanted everything to be right. You have a great house. You don't want to lose that momentum. And so I would watch, and if I was in the main event that night, and I would watch 2 guys, 4 guys, whatever it was, sitting in a circle, and Eddie would be just watching, and he would let them, well, because a lot of times is everybody knew where they had to go from there. In other words, this is what we need to build on for next week, whether we're specifically in the match or build something that if it's not met next week, we're in the thought process for the week after. We're planting a seed. And guys would sit there, and I would watch Eddie, and there would be like 4 of them. If there was a card table, they were playing cards. That would be the scenario, but they weren't playing cards. It was just 4 chairs, and the guys, would start out with just what if we did this? And then somebody would say, well, we could do this, we could do that. And Eddie would watch, and I would watch him on his folding chair, and he would come forward 2 inches, and he's got his head cocked and he's listening, and he would let them take the conversation as far as like their ability and experience would allow them to take it, and they would think that they were on the right path and where they were going to come back, or for next week or the week after, or say we can go from here and we could do this on television to take the next step, and then come back in the arena and take the next step in the arena. And Eddie would watch, and Eddie would move forward, and Eddie was never one he wouldn't put anybody down. He would listen, and he'd just be leaning forward, and he'd ease forward, and it's next thing you know, he's there listening as part of the conversation, but not saying anything.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would, he was so smooth because he didn't want to dampen their enthusiasm. The last thing he was going to say was, I think you guys are going the whole wrong direction. Even if he was thinking that, he would very subtly come out of left field and plant a seed, and then very subtly take the whole thing out to left field to work the next thing. And the guys wouldn't even realize what Eddie had done. And that's why he was a true genius. He had a 7th grade education, but Eddie Graham was a PhD in our business, and he was a genius. And he would, and then he would give one little thing. And a lot of times the guys with experience would take that little thing and then enhance on it, so that it wouldn't be Eddie coming in and just taking what they had done and scrap it and give them a whole new thing. He was so good at a lot of times you could plant a seed with somebody, and then they take it, and then where they end up at the end of the line, they're convinced that this was their idea all along. Yep. Mm-hmm. And Eddie's just sitting there, and Eddie didn't need to say, God, you guys aren't that smart. I'm glad I was able to help. No. Eddie was as smooth as they got. Because he owned the territory. He wanted to see everybody be successful. And that's one, and he knew the personalities. He knew who he had to be a little bit more aggressive with and more obvious to get their attention, and others he could just subtly plant a seed and then watch how it went. And then if he had to kind of nudge it back on course, he would do that too. God, I loved being around Eddie Graham. He had the reputation of being a genius, and he affected the careers of Bill Watts, of Dusty Rhodes. They were all products of the Eddie Graham School of Education. And boy, I wanted to be there and be under the learning tree. And like I say, he had more greater influence on me than anybody else in the business.
Definitely known as one of the geniuses of wrestling. Such a great territory down in Florida.
Yeah.
Built it up so well.
And I think Eddie, because I was a little bit older, I wasn't like a young kid, and Eddie could tell where my heart was. And he finally, as part of my as part of my education and part of my growth, on Friday nights they would run, major towns all week, and on Friday night they ran two towns. They would run Tallahassee and they would run Fort Lauderdale. Well, Mike Graham had a lady friend down in Fort Lauderdale that he wanted to be in Fort Lauderdale every week. It was a little bit longer trip up over by the Panhandle to Tallahassee. And so I was in Tallahassee every week and was featured because I was there every week. And Eddie would, when going over what we were going to do that night for finishes on the card, Eddie would then had me call him, and we would talk about where we were going next week and what we were doing, and he would guide me. He would be like he would guide me. I don't know how else to put it. And then finally, Eddie would say, he finally one day said, he said, and you could see growth, and that's good for business, and it's also good for my self-esteem. And a lot of it was a result of the help that I got from Eddie. And finally, Eddie said, I'd like to come up to Tallahassee on a Friday, and he ended up pushing me as a top guy there because I was there every week. And he said, I'd like to come up, and what do you think about you and I work in a 3-week program? What? What do I think about it? When I think about it, commit to coming before you think about it and change your mind. God, yes, please. And so now Eddie's up in the town, and again, that was like the next step up in my learning curve. And we worked out the 3-week thing, and at the end of it, because Eddie was Eddie and was over so big, he didn't work that much anymore, but he was like he was like Babe Ruth, the baseball, Eddie Graham was Eddie. And so obviously at the end of the 3-week program, Eddie had to get his hand raised somehow, but then got his hand raised and then got laid out on a stretcher after. And I got my heat back because he understood the big picture. I love that man, and I miss him terrible. He had a tremendous impact on me and my career and me as a person.
And as far as Eddie Graham and Dusty, obviously Dusty was kind of one of his proteges as well. And you and Dusty become kind of attached to the hip for a long time as far as Florida, and then Crockett, and then eventually even the WWF.
Yeah, and I mean, Dusty has passed on, and Eddie would come to me and he would say, Dusty is box office in the Tampa territory, but if left to his own devices, he will self-destruct.
Wow.
In other words, he can't help himself because too much would start to work the other way. So in other words, Eddie was telling me in a way, I don't know, I had an office and I had there was a big desk, and there was a little one lounge chair in the corner, and then there was like a hallway, maybe 10, 12 feet long, and then a doorway down there. And it was just a small office. And Eddie would come in, and he would plop down in that lounge chair, and I would I would try not to say anything so that he had to talk, and I could have the benefit of whatever he was thinking that day.
Mm-hmm.
And he had told me, he said, that Dusty was a great, great talent. And just the box office records that he has in Florida. But But sometimes great talent need to be managed too. And of course, a lot of times those guys get to the point where, well, they want to be bookers, they want to be the architect of their own destiny, and that's when sometimes things can go the other way. So, and I learned this from Eddie, and he said, I when the timing was right, I would want Dusty to be there. He would jumpstart my business. We'd have a hell of a run, and then before Dusty, when it would happen without him realizing what was happening. If we didn't do something, it's like kind of going up. You reach that plateau, and then all of a sudden there's got to be a downside to everything. So what Vince would do, and and he shared this with me, and it just was between him and I. He would say, I realize that I need to get Dusty out. I need to, so that before that self-destruct thing happens. So Eddie had a great relationship with Vince Sr., who would live up he actually lived close to where I live now in Delaware for the summer months. And in the winter months, he would go down to Fort Lauderdale, where the warm weather. And so, I don't know where I was going with my train of thought, but anyway, he would when he realized that too much of Dusty was not a good thing either, then Vince could, Eddie could call Vince and say, I think Eddie had a way of doing it where it's okay. I've had Dusty, I had a hell of a run with him, but I don't want him to be overexposed here. And I want to send him somewhere where I know that he's going to be looked after. And this was probably an initial conversation. And so Vince knew exactly what the story was. So it's okay. Eddie is telling me there's a time now where Dusty, it's going to be better for Dusty and better for the Florida territory to get Dusty out for a little bit. And I wanted him to go somewhere where he's going to make money, be taken care of, and where Eddie had a relationship with Vince Sr., so that they would already know in advance when the time was right for Dusty to come back to Florida. And so he would tell Dusty, he said, "Oh man, Vince is down a little bit, and boy, he didn't call me and ask me, but you're the one guy that could go up there and just explode that garden, and they need some help." So now it's like it almost becomes Eddie talking to Dusty in a way where Dusty's feeling really good about himself because he's saying Vince needs help, and I'm the one guy that can help him. And Eddie's going to say it's okay for me to go up there, knowing that I'm going to come back here. So they'd be like ping ponging back and forth. He would go up there and have a hell of a run in New York, and before he would, burn out, so that he could come back and have another run. Then it's like, hey, God, things are down, Dusty. God, I need you. I need you, and Dusty would feed off of that.
Yeah, it's so great because you can use them in New York as a feature for a small period of time, and then bring them back fresh to Florida again. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I love that Eddie trusted you with this information, because you never know. You tell one of the boys, and all of a sudden they're going to try to take Dusty's spot and maybe kill Dusty's ego and say, "Oh, Dusty, you ain't the star you think you are," and things like that. But he trusted you enough to know that you, first of all, would know exactly what he meant. And then second of all, he knew that you weren't going to say anything to Dusty like, "Oh, we're sending you up there because we're getting tired of you down here." Something like that where it would ruffle feathers.
Yeah, that wasn't my MO and my relationship with Eddie. And what happened too was I wanted to work for Eddie. And again, everything that happens in your career is part of your education. Like taking classes, and You got to take certain classes along the way to build your foundation. And so, with Eddie, I wanted to learn from him, which I did. And he was a great judge of character of an individual. And he had showed me such great respect and guided me and protected me from making mistakes or doing something or getting off on the wrong thing. And my personality was such that it wasn't like it went to my head and it's like, well, I don't need Eddie's help anymore. I got this all figured out. And Eddie, I think, respected that. And we never had this in a conversational way, but Eddie respected that's how I was because I demonstrated it with how I ran my business and everything that I did. So Eddie didn't feel vulnerable. He knew that he could help guide me and that I would never take offense that I can figure this out myself. I don't need your help. No. That wasn't that way. And so that was the reason I had such a great relationship and such a longevity with Eddie. It really was.
And I love how we can just kind of talk about one topic and then go into Eddie Graham and go into Florida and talk about all these awesome things throughout wrestling history with you. And what we're going to do each and every week on the show. I mean, we're just going to delve deeper and deeper into topics. And like I said, we're kind of talking about you, wrestler into the executive role. And I feel like this is a good stopping point because then next week we can really kind of launch and go even deeper into you becoming the executive with Vince and go into 89, go into 96 and kind of talk about the WWF days and going into Vince, because all this leads into you working for the biggest promoter ever in the history of the business, Vince McMahon Jr. Yep. So I think this is all great. And I'm really looking forward to not only stories about you and Vince Jr., but that kind of triangle of terror that you always hear about. And not really terror, it's actually a triangle of genius. Is really you, Vince, and Pat Patterson together working, and how that relationship was basically so key and so huge. And that's when wrestling was huge. You had those three major guys, you, Vince, and Pat.
One quick story before we wrap up this session. It was like Eddie... I used to treasure those moments where Eddie came into my office, not because it wasn't like he had a purpose in coming in, and he would plop down in that chair and, we could talk about the Tampa matches that week or where we were going the week or what we were going to do on TV. And the one week, it was just a general conversation. And I looked at Eddie and I said, it doesn't seem that long ago when a young kid in Trenton, New Jersey used to go up to Madison Square Garden in New York and watch Dr. Jerry Graham and Eddie Graham. I can't tell you how many times I sat out there in the audience and watched you. And of course, Jerry Graham with a cigar and interviews was the flamboyant one. And Eddie was just there, very stoic and very quiet. And then as I got more involved in my career, I come to find out, that Jerry Graham is a bit of a goofball, but the guy standing behind him that you'd never hear anything from is a true genius. And so I just, and you hear it, and then I knew from Eddie. So Eddie, the one day, when he came into my office, and I don't even know what triggered the conversation. We were just talking. I said, God, Eddie, I sit here and I look at you and I think, man, it wasn't that many years ago that I'm sitting in Trenton and going to the Garden and watching you and Dr. Jerry Graham and with Rocco and Perez and just the sold out Garden with all the atmosphere in New York City and dreaming that, God, maybe someday I too could become a professional wrestler. And If you're going to dream, then I too might someday step through those ropes in Madison Square Garden. But at that point, I was in Florida, uh, wrestling some, but not full time, more of a manager at that point. And I said that, he said, and I guess, I never worked in New York territory. So that dream, if you want to call it a dream, never came to fruition. And now I'm a little bit older and a different phase of the business. And I said, yeah, it wasn't like I was, it was kind of like, God, that was a moment in time that, God, I dreamed that maybe someday it would happen and it didn't. And I'm okay with that without saying it that way. And I think Eddie said, yeah, he said, work in the garden, that would have meant something to you, wouldn't it? And yeah, it really would have. And then there was no purpose in him making that comment, and how I replied. So Eddie left, and I'm back to my work. And a day or two goes by, and Eddie comes to my office again, and he said, and I had like a big monthly calendar that I could flip up, and then I had my own my book with all my cards and everything in it, what we drew and all this. And then he said, go ahead it was like, the date was April 23rd of 1986 or 84. I can't see from here. 84, I want to say. And he comes in, and I was working in the office, and he said, go through we were going ahead like a month, and he said, Monday, April 24th, they would run West Palm Beach, and he said, put a circle around that date and put a note to make sure that you don't book yourself. Where's this conversation going?
Where's he going with this?
Yeah, and he then said, you're going to fly up to New York that day. You're going to be in the garden.
Wow. Unbelievable.
I mean, even after all these years, it's like emotional thinking about it. And it's like if somebody said you had a dream, and it's a dream that will now never come true, but I'm okay with it. And then all of a sudden, here's the fairy godfather that's there with a magic wand that just looks at you and says, going to New York on that day. And he said, I called Senior, because Senior would be in Fort Lauderdale for the winter. And he said, and Senior remembered me because I started refereeing my second year of college and in Pennsylvania, and worked all the big shows. And Vince Senior would come to the arena or convention hall in Philadelphia for the big shows. So he got to know me on a first, he used to call me Jimmy, got to know me on a first name basis. And so when Eddie called him and told this story, shared this story with Vince about Eddie's conversation with me and about the garden, and that, I had been there and thought about it and said, oh, probably never happened. And Senior said to Eddie, he said, we got to take care of this. We got to make it happen. And so he said, we'll fly him up to New York on that Monday. He'll work the garden. We're flying him up for just one day, and he'll come back the next day. So he won't, he just have one day where he's, not there because he works for you in the office, and you need him to be there, but that one day. And so Eddie told me that, and it was like, it's like, am I dreaming this? Is this conversation real? I'm pinching myself. And he said, yeah, I talked to Vince, and Vince, he said, oh, Jimmy, he's such a wonderful guy. And I thought the world of him. We need to make this happen. And how many people could say that the conversation with Eddie Graham wasn't to plant a seed for something to happen. It was just a casual conversation. Eddie calls Vince. Vince says, "Oh, I remember Jimmy. What a nice guy. He's such a credit to the business, and I'm so happy that he's down there and doing well for you." And didn't realize that it would have meant a lot to him in that garden. So we needed to make this happen. And Eddie said, "All right, well we won't book him here for that day." And Vince said, "We'll give him a plane ticket, fly him up here, put him up in the hotel, and he'll work the garden, and we'll fly him back." And when Eddie told me, and I said, "Well, it was a done deal." It wasn't like Eddie was the one saying, "You're not booked here that day. You're there." And it's like Eddie booked me with a conversation with Vince. And Vince was happy to do it because I had gained his respect and he respected me. And it wasn't a matter of flying somebody up for one expense for somebody that wasn't like going to be a big deal on the card that day. They were doing it for altogether different reasons. It's because this is something they always dreamed of doing and we want to make it happen. And Eddie said he's got the day off, and Vince said, "Well, I'll fly him up. We'll put him up in a hotel. He'll work the garden and fly back." And it was just that simple. And I got up there that day, and I have the program insert from the garden on that day. And the main events that day was Sergeant Slaughter against the Iron Sheik was the main event in the garden of that show. Greg the Hammer Valentine against Bob Backlund. Tito Santana was supposed to be against one of the Samoans in a single match. There was a 6-man match with Roddy Piper, Paul Orndorff, and David Schultz. And they were against Tony Atlas, Rocky Johnson, and Ivan Putski. Brian Blair was on the card, and they had a girls match, and then at the bottom and just my name was listed like a couple of guys that were also on the card. And then when I got up there that day, they were taping for the Garden Network. They say, "Well, we want to put you in an Intercontinental title match with Greg Valentine," and I'd worked with Tito Santana, and I'd worked with. I think Tito had his first match with me when he came out of West Texas State, and I was, on top of Amarillo and working in the office, and so that's how far back I went with him, and it was like, wow. So obviously a great comfort level there. I remember, because I wasn't wrestling every night, I thought, here's my dream come true. I'm in Madison Square Garden. And if I had a magic wand, I could go back in time where I was working every night and then put myself here. But I can't do that. And my worst fear was to go out there and, embarrass myself by here I am finally in the garden and I don't have a good match, whether I'm not in shape or whatever. So I worked with Tito. I remember we went 8 or 9 minutes, and Tito went over, and Pat Patterson and Gorilla Monsoon were doing the commentary at ringside because they were on the Madison Square Garden network. So I actually have a tape of that match, and I knew Monsoon from way back when, and I knew Pat, but their audience had no idea who I was in New York City. So there really wasn't a whole lot to talk about in terms of the match itself, because to their audience in New York, they didn't really know me. I was there only because Vince McMahon wanted me to be there to make my dream come true. And so in the commentary, they talk a lot about Tito, and then they talk about whatever else was going on, and didn't make too much reference to the mechanics of the match. But so it's like, hey, once again, I have been so blessed in my career that at that time, if I had thought, I just thought, I dreamed of being in the Garden, and later in my career, I'm more manager in Florida. Probably never happened. And Eddie Graham calls Vince McMahon. We're going to make it happen. They've paid to fly me up there and work the Garden. I wasn't like a big star being flown in for a big. They just went to the expense to get it up there because they wanted me to be able to live my dream.
Wow, that is awesome, and thank you for sharing that, because I could tell you're getting emotional from it. It's just Eddie Graham did such a nice thing. Vince did such a nice thing. Awesome story, and I love that. They made your dream come true just for no other reason, that they liked you enough for them to let your dreams happen.
Yep, and they had the power to do it, and it didn't detract from the card, but it was also a plane ticket up from Tampa to New York and a hotel room for somebody that, if they were having to justify the expense, why are we flying this guy up here? But they were the powers to be, and they wanted me to be there, and I guess it speaks for the level of respect that I had in the business, which was a cumulative thing for my whole career. And because of that respect, Eddie Graham called Vince and wanted to make my dream come true, and they did.
I love it, and it's just such a great story, and it's just a taste, just a tip of the iceberg as far as this journey down wrestling's past with you, JJ Dillon, on the JJ Show. Just basically called just JJ, but for sake of the show, we'll say it's the JJ Dillon podcast, and this is really just an awesome trip down memory lane. It's only the beginning, as we will delve deep into more and more topics